Nora Ellison's fingers had stopped working almost an hour before anyone found her. 7 years old, hiding behind a dumpster in 4-degree cold, wearing a thin cotton nightgown and no shoes. She had been locked outside her own apartment for 2 hours and 11 minutes when a nurse riding home from a night shift heard a sound that had stopped being crying and started being something else entirely. The kind of low, exhausted moan a body makes when it is almost finished shivering because it is running out of reasons to keep trying. What happened in the 6 hours after that would end with 180 motorcycles lined up outside the county courthouse and a stepfather who believed no one would ever come looking, learning exactly how wrong a man could be. Ridgeview, Michigan, sat close enough to Lake Huron that winter arrived in November and didn't fully let go until April. And Cedar Court Apartments sat on the unlucky side of town, where the snowplows came last, and the streetlights had burned out 2 winters ago, without anyone from the city bothering to replace them. Wind came off the lake most nights with nothing to slow it down for 11 flat miles, and the temperature that particular Tuesday had dropped low enough that the local news had run a cold weather advisory at 6 o'clock, the kind most people forgot about by bedtime. The dumpster enclosure behind Building C sat in permanent shadow. Wedged between a chain-link fence and a row of frozen arborvitae nobody had trimmed in years, the one corner of the complex where even the security light didn't reach. Dawn Whitlow was 39 years old, a road captain with the Iron Vow Motorcycle Club and an emergency room nurse at Ridgeview General, and she had spent 6 years as an Army combat medic before either of those things. 2 tours. A chest full of memories she rarely discussed, and a habit of scanning every room she entered for the fastest exit, and the person most likely to need help first. It meant she had learned, a long time ago, to recognize the particular stillness of a body running out of time before her mind had even finished forming the word hypothermia. She kept her graying hair cropped short for work, wore steel-toed boots even off duty, and had a laugh that surprised people who only ever saw the size of her shoulders first. She was riding home from a double shift a little after 11 that night, cutting through the Cedar Court lot as a shortcut the way she had 100 times before, when something behind the dumpster caught the edge of her headlight and didn't move the way trash moves. She had her boots off the pegs and was crouched in the frozen gravel before her engine had even finished ticking down. "Hey," she said. Low, careful, the tone she used on patients who'd stopped trusting adults to help them. "Hey, sweetheart, I've got you." Nora didn't answer at first. Her lips had gone the color of the twilight sky, and her eyes, when they finally found Dawn's face, took a long 4 seconds to focus. The particular delay Dawn had seen exactly twice before in her career and never once forgotten. Cold, Nora finally whispered, the single word costing her more effort than a sentence should. "I know, baby. I know you are. I've got you now." Before we get any further, if this is your first time here, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because what Dawn found out over the following hours wasn't only about frostbite and a cold night. It was about a little girl who had been taught, carefully and deliberately, that nobody was coming for her. Now, back to the dumpster, and the 2 hours before Dawn ever got there. Nora Ellison was 7 years old, small even for her age, with a chip in her front tooth from a bicycle accident the summer before, and a stuffed rabbit named Pepper that she had stopped bringing places because Pepper always seemed to make things worse when he got noticed. She still counted ceiling tiles when she was scared, a habit she'd started at 4 and never grown out of. And she still saved the crust of her sandwich for last, because her real father, before he moved to Ohio and stopped calling, used to tell her the crust was where all the vitamins hid, and some part of her still believed if she ate it, something of him stayed with her a little longer. She kept a drawing taped inside her closet door, a stick figure family from a kindergarten assignment 2 years back, and had never once updated it to include Russ. Her mother, Carla, worked the overnight shift as a certified nursing assistant at a memory care facility 20 minutes north. A job she'd taken 8 months ago because it paid $2 more an hour than the diner, and because Russ had told her, more than once, that a family needed a second income if she wanted new clothes for Nora come fall. Carla loved her daughter with the fierce, exhausted love of a woman working 60 hours a week, and did not yet know, because Nora had been taught carefully not to tell her, exactly what happened in the 4 hours between Carla leaving for work and Russ deciding he'd had enough of a 7-year-old's noise for one evening. Russ Kepler had married Carla 2 years ago, moved into the apartment with the easy confidence of a man who believed a roof he paid half of gave him the final word on everything under it. He worked at the tire plant, drank most nights, and had developed over the last year a particular method of discipline he preferred over yelling when Nora spilled something, or cried too loud, or existed too visibly for his patients that evening. He sent her outside. Not for long, he told himself. Only long enough to learn. Tonight, not for long had become 2 hours, because Russ had fallen asleep in front of the television with 3 beers in him, and forgotten entirely that a 7-year-old was standing on the other side of a locked door in 4-degree weather. Until well past the point where forgetting had become something closer to not caring at all. He would tell himself later, in the version of the story he practiced in his head before anyone else heard it, that he'd meant to check on her after one more inning of the game he wasn't even watching anymore. Nora had knocked until her knuckles hurt. She had called through the door until her voice went hoarse. When neither worked, and the cold started doing something to her thinking that made everything feel slow and impossibly far away, she had wandered, the way lost, freezing children sometimes do, toward movement instead of stillness, toward the one place in the complex with a working light, and ended up behind the dumpster at Building C, where the wind at least couldn't reach her directly, and where she had curled herself as small as she could and stopped calling for anyone at all. Dawn wrapped her in the emergency blanket she kept in her saddlebag, lifted her, barely 40 pounds, impossibly light in a way that made Dawn's jaw tighten, and got her into the warm cab of a passing delivery driver's truck, who'd stopped when he saw Dawn waving him down, running the heater at full while Dawn called it in, and started working through the questions that mattered most. Name, age, where do you live, is anyone home? The delivery driver, a heavy-set man named Curtis, who'd been making the same overnight route for 6 years, kept both hands on the wheel and his eyes forward, saying nothing, understanding without needing to be told that his job right now was to keep the heat running and stay out of the way. Russ, Nora finally said, teeth still chattering too hard to shape the word cleanly. He said, think about it. Think about what, honey? I don't remember, Nora whispered. I don't remember what I did wrong. That sentence would stay with Dawn longer than almost anything else that night. Nora was admitted to Ridgeview General with moderate hypothermia and frostnip on 3 fingers that the ER doctor said, with another 20 minutes outside, could easily have become something surgeons would have needed to discuss. Dawn stayed at her bedside until Carla arrived, pulled from her shift by a call that made her drive the 20 minutes home in 12. Russ arrived 40 minutes after that. Having been woken by Dawn's own call, she'd made it professionally, factually, the way she'd learned to deliver bad news in a combat zone, and he walked into that hospital room with the particular confidence of a man who had never once imagined consequences catching up to him before dinner. He hadn't changed out of his undershirt, hadn't brushed his hair, and carried himself with the loose, unbothered posture of someone who still believed this was a conversation he could talk his way out of before it became anything more than an inconvenience. She wandered off, Russ said, to the room in general, to the nurse, to anyone who'd listen. Kids do that. I fell asleep. I didn't hear her come back in. That's an accident. That's not. The door was locked from the inside, Dawn said. 6 words. She couldn't get back in. I don't know what she told you, Russ said, but she gets confused. Makes things up. Kids exaggerate, especially when they're scared. She has frostnip on 3 fingers, Dawn said. That's not something a 7-year-old exaggerates into existence. Russ's eyes flicked toward Nora, then away again, the particular look of a man recalculating how much of the room already believed the version he hadn't finished building yet. Nora, small in the hospital bed with an IV taped to the back of one bandaged hand, watched her stepfather's mouth move and said nothing at all. The particular silence of a child who has learned, through repetition, exactly what happens to children who contradict adults. The room held that silence for a long moment, nobody willing to be the one who broke it first. Carla's face had gone through several stages since walking in: panic, relief, and now something colder settling in behind her eyes as she looked between her daughter's bandaged fingers and her husband's easy explanation. "Russ," she said quietly, "how long was she outside?" "I don't know. 10 minutes. Maybe." The nurse said 2 hours. Carla's voice had dropped to something flat and still. 2 hours. Russ's confidence, for the first time all night, showed the smallest crack, and he reached instead for authority. "I'm her father in every way that matters, and I'm taking her home right now before this turns into something it doesn't need to be." He stepped toward the bed and reached for Nora's arm. That was when Dawn stood up. She didn't rush. She'd learned a long time ago, in places considerably more dangerous than a hospital room, that rushing was for people who hadn't already decided how a situation was going to end. She set down the coffee she'd been nursing since midnight, unhurried, and stepped between Russ and the bed. "You're not taking her anywhere." 6 words. "This isn't your family," Russ said, louder now. "It is tonight." 4 words. "I'll call my lawyer," Russ said. "I'll call the police myself if I have to, and we'll see whose side the law takes." "Go ahead and call them," Dawn said. "While you're waiting, you should know Child Protective Services is already on their way. I called them from the parking lot before the ambulance arrived." Russ's face went through its own stages, then confidence, disbelief, and something considerably uglier underneath both. "You had no right to. I had a phone and a 7-year-old with frostbite." Dawn didn't raise her voice. She never had to. "I had every right." Carla, still standing near the window, hadn't said a word in almost a minute. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost the fear it carried when she first walked in and picked up something flatter, harder, a tone Dawn suspected Russ had never once heard from her before. 2 hours, Carla said again, to nobody in particular, like she was still doing the math and couldn't make it come out any way that forgave him. Russ's jaw worked, searching for the next thing that had always worked before, and found nothing that fit a room where a nurse in a leather cut wasn't backing down, and a wife was staring at him with an expression he'd never once seen on her face in 2 years of marriage. He pulled out his phone instead, thumbing toward a number, muttering something about how this whole situation was about to get considerably more complicated for everybody standing in that room. That was when the first sound reached them from the parking lot below. Low, at first. The kind of sound most people in a hospital hallway mistake for a generator running somewhere in the building, until it kept building instead of leveling off. Steady, deliberate, gathering from 3 directions at once, the way weather gathers before it arrives all together. "What is that?" Russ asked, phone still halfway to his ear. Dawn didn't answer. She didn't need to. Engines, first, then the wash of headlights sweeping across the hospital parking lot, windows 3 floors down. 180 motorcycles rolling into the visitor lot in a slow, disciplined column, filling every open space and half the fire lane besides, engines dying in sequence until the parking lot below held nothing but exhaust steam rising into the cold, and a silence loud enough that even Russ, 3 floors up, seemed to feel it pressing against the window glass. A security guard who'd worked the night shift at Ridgeview General for 19 years came out to the lobby doors, looked at the sight in front of him, and went back inside without a word to let it happen. Dawn had sent one message from the ambulance bay 2 hours earlier, a single line to the chapter group text, the kind that had never once failed to move 100 people in under 20 minutes. Nobody had asked her to explain further. Nobody ever did. Not one rider so much as glanced toward the hospital entrance where Russ would eventually have to walk out. That detail, more than the number, more than the engines, was the one that finally reached him through the window, the sense that somewhere below him, 180 people had already decided he no longer mattered enough to look at directly. Duke Callahan came up first, the Iron Vows chapter president, gray at the temples. The same steady authority he'd carried into a dozen situations exactly like this one over 11 years running the chapter. He'd ridden the last 4 miles without a jacket zipped fully against the cold, having left his own dinner unfinished on the table the moment Dawn's text came through. He found Dawn in the hallway outside Nora's room and didn't wait for an explanation. "How's the girl?" 4 words. Stable, scared. Dawn glanced back toward the door. Stepfather's in there trying to talk his way out of 2 hours in a locked apartment courtyard. Duke's expression, already grim, went somewhere colder. He stepped past her into the room, and for the first time that night, Russ Kepler found himself looking up at a man who did not look even slightly interested in what Russ had to say. "Sir, this is a private family matter," Russ started. "Not anymore," Duke said. 3 words. Nora, watching from the bed, looked at the enormous gray-haired stranger standing over her stepfather and, for the first time in 2 hours, felt something in her chest loosen that had been clenched since the door locked behind her. She didn't understand yet who these people were or why there were so many of them. She understood only that Russ, for the first time she could ever remember, looked smaller than the room around him. Child Protective Services arrived 11 minutes later, alongside 2 Ridgeview police officers who took one look at the parking lot, then at the frostbite chart on Nora's door, and did not need much further convincing about which version of the evening's events to believe. Russ was escorted out through a hospital lobby line, without a single word exchanged, by 180 people who watched him go the way people watch weather clear, not with satisfaction, only relief that it had passed. He didn't deserve more of this story than that. He didn't get more. Nora spent 3 days in the hospital recovering full feeling in all but one fingertip, which the doctors said would likely stay a little numb the rest of her life. A small permanent reminder she wouldn't fully understand the size of until she was older. Carla filed for an emergency protective order the same week and moved herself and Nora into her sister's house across town before Russ's bail hearing even finished. The county charged him with child endangerment and neglect. And this time, nobody in that courtroom needed convincing that 2 hours in 4-degree weather had been anything but exactly the 2 hours it was. 180 motorcycles had also been parked outside a hospital that night with a security camera timestamp nobody could argue with. And Russ's attorney, when he finally saw the footage, advised him to accept whatever plea the county offered rather than let a jury hear the whole story out loud. Dawn visited twice a week after that, off-duty, no scrubs. Only a woman who'd once found a little girl behind a dumpster and had not been able to make herself stop checking in since. She taught Nora, slowly, that a locked door didn't have to mean nobody was coming, and brought Pepper a small leather vest one Saturday, sewn by hand, so the rabbit could finally stop making things worse when he got noticed. Nora still counts ceiling tiles sometimes when she's scared. But these days, when she gets to 20, she's usually already found somebody's face to look at instead, and the counting stops before she reaches 30. She updated her kindergarten drawing last spring, added a stick figure in a leather vest standing next to her stick figure self, and taped it back inside the closet door where she still keeps it. Not because anyone told her to, but because some pictures need updating once you learn who actually shows up. Carla still works the overnight shift, though at a different facility now, one close enough to her sister's house that she can be home in 4 minutes flat if she ever needs to be. She keeps Dawn's numbers saved under a single word in her phone and has used it more than once, not for emergencies, but for the ordinary, unremarkable reassurance of knowing somebody else was thinking about her daughter too. If this story reached you, if you believe that no child should ever have to wonder whether anyone is coming for them, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs reminding that showing up is sometimes the whole entirety of saving a life. Subscribe to Iron Vow Stories so you never miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, how cold was it where you grew up, and did anyone ever show up for you the way Dawn showed up for Nora?